This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to invite Uncle Lewis O'Brien to provide the Welcome to Country.
Marawachanga, Ghana Mina Nai Wangani, Mani Nabundi Ghani, Atana. Naibiriko, Mankalakala, Tandanya, Mianaku. Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakanandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. Natalia.
Thank you, Uncle Lewis. On behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia, I welcome you all to our presentation, Aboriginal Children Speak, Criminal Responsibility and the Rights of the Child. Tonight's panel will consider the issues explored in the film In My Blood It Runs, through discussion on the rights of Aboriginal children in relation to criminality, Australian and international laws, and hearing Aboriginal children speak. This is an opportunity to be involved in a conversation about global issues of significance and to hear about the extensive work that our panellists have undertaken to inform public knowledge and awareness. I would like to thank each of the panellists for their time and contribution, and also to thank Professor Irene Watson and Amy Cleland for their wonderful work. This event is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website. We encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not join us online. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Stan Grant, who will introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Hawke Centre for inviting me as well, and my respects to all of the First Nations people whose land we're on, who might be listening to this, and everyone else who's listening to this conversation, a really important conversation about the elders of tomorrow, our children, and how we protect our children. As Irene mentioned there, Irene will be involved in this discussion as well. She mentioned Dr. Sharon Venn, of course, Indigenous Rights Attorney, United Nations Rights of the Child. Also mentioned Cheryl Axelby, the Chief Executive Officer of the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, and of course, Irene herself, Professor Irene Watson, Pro Vice Chancellor, Aboriginal Leadership and Strategy, and Professor of Law at Uni SA. And Irene, I think I will begin with you, and I wanted to touch on the film that really informs this discussion, In My Blood It Runs. All of us, I'm sure, have had an opportunity to see that film, and it's remarkable. I've seen it maybe 4 or 5 times now. I just keep going back to it and I keep getting more from it. The remarkable intellect and wisdom and just vivacious personality, that wide-eyed wonder of the remarkable Dujuan Hoosan. Just a remarkable child. And to see the failure of an education system that fails to see the capacity of that intellect and to provide an environment where that incredible mind could flourish. What did you take away from watching that film?
Well, I think the importance of Aboriginal education in our way, and Duane kept referring back to that, but not only Duane, many of us as many of our elders have always noted the importance of Aboriginal education, of learning the language, of learning our culture, and of understanding our history as colonised peoples, and the difficult time we are in now in terms of being colonised people, and that position we're in that we live in 2 worlds, and that's what I took away from the story of Duane, is how he's positioned as a young person. I think the film began when he was 9 years old, so I think about all the 9-year-olds that I know, the young people, and for our young people to be positioned to have to navigate two worlds is difficult to say the least. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, and it's a gross injustice that our young people have to live through these pressures of having to navigate the world that they live in, and to be to say, as he said in the film, and I've heard this over and over again from my old people, from my family, and I feel it myself, is how to the right to be Aboriginal. The right to be an Aboriginal person and to live an Aboriginal life in the colonised environment that we're all subjected to is the question for me, and how we navigate the path to decolonial, to decolonise our lives, so that our children can have a future. But clearly, being subjected to a colonised lifestyle is for me the difficult terrain that we navigate, and it's not for us to fix. It's for the colonial to work out how they decolonise the space and work with us to enable the children of the future to be able to be Aboriginal.
It's really interesting just listening to you saying that, Irene, because so much comes back to me, and the way that school particularly shapes our lives and sets our place in the world. And I remember vividly when all of us have these memories, and they never leave us. But I remember so vividly the very first time I encountered the world of difference and the world of whiteness, when I started school at the age of 5. And I can close my eyes and I can picture it as if it was yesterday, when a little boy put his arm next to mine, white boy, and he said, "Why are you so black?" In that moment, all of our lives are framed. That he instinctively knew that to be white was normal. The other kids in the class, the school teacher, the local police, the people who worked in the shops, when he turned on his television, that white was normal and white came with power. That boy never stopped to ask himself, why am I so white? Why is he so white? He said, why are you so black? And of course, for me at that moment, I have to have an answer. That we are framed in this world, but we have to explain ourselves just to exist. Cheryl, we talk about living in two worlds. In fact, quite the reality for us is we are subsumed by one world, seeking to be the people, as Irene said, that we choose to be. Two worlds are not two equal worlds, are they?
Well, they are, and just like listening to you reflect on your story, Stan, I do remember my very first day in primary school too, and my experience was being shoved and, grabbed by the arm by the teacher and treated quite disrespectfully because I was an Aboriginal kid. Violently? Yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
Exactly, and it was that sort of treatment throughout primary school was my experience, which a lot of our children in particular struggle within the school environment. But, the living between two worlds, one thing about Dujuan that I really took from his strength was the strength of the elders and culture behind him and the resilience that he got out of that, to be able to now articulate and talk about the experience that he has. I think that's, to me, is why culture and our identity instilled in us as young fellas is really critical and important going forward, because it creates that resilience for us to be able to survive this two-world concept that we have to navigate our way through all our lives. And, for me personally, I just think about, the two worlds concept. Like it's not a concept for white people. Because they view their world and their only way as being normal, and they expect us to embrace and become part of that colonial context and challenge us about our identity and say, well, why do you want to be always different? Well, it's not about being different. It's about being who I am and who we are as a people, First Nations people of this country. And I'm proud of that fact. And, you fellas could learn a lot from our ways, probably a lot more, actual fact. a lot less trauma would be impacted in general in society, in my view, by people learning our ways.
Cheryl, I'll come to Old Woman Bear Sharon in just a minute, but Cheryl, I just want to stay with you on that. It's often occurred to me, and I've used this analogy, that trying to talk to people who haven't lived our lives, who haven't walked in our shoes, to talk to them about racism is like talking to someone about ghosts. They just don't see it. It's like something that is superstitious. It's not real. And of course we see it and we know it. What do you draw on culturally? You talk about the importance of culture, and I remember one wonderful moment in the film when the old women are sitting around after Dujuan's been kicked out of yet another school, and they say, hang on, this school's meant to be for us. Yeah. We set this school up. Who are they, white teachers, to kick an Aboriginal kid out of the school? When you talk about that culture, what did you draw on from your old people when you were young that gave you the strength to achieve what you've achieved and to live in these worlds?
Well, I think it's because we grew up, and particularly when I think about my elders, you know, they instilled in us a sense of pride, you know, in us as peoples. They instilled in us morals and taught us about respect. Now, there were these cultural contexts that I feel that you were free without constraints to be an individual and loved unconditionally. That is my memories of my elders. You know, they pulled you into line when you needed to be pulled into line, but they let you explore and they let you be. And that was part of the way of you learning from your lessons, I suppose, by being able to make some mistakes, but they sat down and talked to you about, you know, the impact of whatever it is that you did. And I think for me, that strength in being proud of who we are and, you know, spending that time with our elders. And when you talk about the school context, you know, and as an example that happens on the APY lands in South Australia, is that they had schools and they were supposed to be teaching school, you know, schools in the context, an Aboriginal context, embracing language, and yet there still is an imposed colonial context in regards to the school setup and how it's delivered to kids even in the APY lands. So the elders play a key critical role, and I feel that their voices and their insights are often ignored even now today through the education system, because our culture doesn't matter in the colonial worldview. It's not important. It's something that agitates, I feel, government services and bureaucrats. It agitates them because we continue to advocate for our identity and for our rights. And it's seen as a problem, and that's the issue.
You're not a problem, Cheryl. You are there to make them uncomfortable.
Exactly.
You know, and that's the important work. Sharon, if I come to you on this, did you get to see the film at all? Has it played in Canada? Have you had a chance to see it?
If it's played in Canada, I haven't seen it. I saw that there's a link on the website to it, but I didn't actually watch it. I find it very hard to watch any kind of show that depicts our children. Or I remember trying to watch Rabbitproof Fence, was it, one time, and I couldn't watch it. This reminded me too much of what I know of my own world. And then I started watching something of, there was a movie called something with Charlie. I can't remember what the whole title was. I started watching that movie, and then I couldn't watch it. So I have a very difficult time watching those kinds of things. It's too close to what we've experienced in our territories. And so kind of out of mind, out of sight kind of attitude of mine. Yeah.
It's not a bad policy in many respects. And for us, I always reflect on this, that for us, we have to open our veins up constantly to be heard, to be seen. And you wonder sometimes, who are we doing this for? Someone asked me the other day about a program that I made. They said, who is the audience? And I said, well, the audience isn't you. The audience is our people, and that we get to speak our truth, and we get to speak those words, and what you do with them is entirely up to you. This is for us. And it is hard. It's hard for us to open ourselves up to that. Sharon, what are the examples from Australia, and just listening to this conversation now about living in two worlds, the colonial impact, the way that those values are represented in a classroom, the physical damage and psychological damage that is done to First Nations people when you walk into that classroom, which can range from benign to hostile, but still takes something from you, takes energy from you. How does that experience resonate with the experience of Canada?
Well, I think if you didn't have the accent, and I'm sure I don't have an accent, because I'm Cree-centric. So if you took the voice away, the accent away, and you put the stories out there, the stories are the same, because of it's colonization. And unfortunately or fortunately, colonizers have no imagination. So they use the same old tired tools that they tried before, and they replicate them. And when they think that it works, they continue to replicate them. So when you read, the history of what they did to people, to the Aboriginals of Australia, or to the people of our Great Turtle Island, or to the Maori, or Hawaii, or any place else you want to name, the stories are the same, because they decided a long time ago that our children had to be changed from their indigenous world into the non-indigenous world, so that we would no longer think like indigenous people, and that we would think like them. But in order to do that, they would have to destroy us, and they have tried to destroy us. So our old people always tell us, have courage, not to ask for strength, because they used to say to us, when you ask for strength, that means like you're saying to the creation, whatever you're doing to me, I can take it, and you can give me more, because I'm asking for strength. So don't ask for strength, ask for courage to go forward. And in the school system, when I was being taken off to school, I still remember my grandmother in our language yelling at me as they were dragging us away. Don't believe a word they say about it's all a lie. And that was one thing that I have never forgot. And so everything that they always said, about us, as who we are, I just knew they were lying. And I always kept that in the front of my head, that this is just a lie. It's not true. And so I can't believe it. And so I never succumbed to that. But I know a lot of our people have, succumbed to that, and it causes a great, fracture in a person's life, because they distrust themselves in what they know about themselves, and that is very destructive. And it's very hard to rebuild that, I find, that trust in yourself. And so it leads to a lot of other issues amongst our nation. And this is one of the things that, the system has done and continues to do, is destroy that link between our creation and us I'm talking about on Turtle Island, and our responsibility to Turtle Island. So to rebuild that is an incredibly hard task, but we still have to continue to try to do that. And I see that all over, our indigenous world, and I travel a lot amongst our people all over the world, and I see the struggle of trying to overcome what the colonized system has tried to do to our people. And it's really, everybody thinks that they're in a unique situation, but at the end of the day, it's not that unique, because colonizers really don't have any imagination, thank God. Thank their God, not our creation, but I've lived in a strange kind of world. Like I don't really, I know that world, and I can go there and I can exist in that world and I can live there, but I'm just existing there. I'm not living there.
Yeah.
It's only when I'm back in my own world that I feel like I'm alive.
Yeah, Irene, we know that feeling, don't we? I was just back home, Wiradjuri country in New South Wales just a couple of weeks ago, and that sense that overcomes you when you move into your land, when the rocks and the trees and the rivers, when those hills that they speak to you, and it is so right, that idea that we exist elsewhere, but we only live in our home. I wanted to ask you, Irene, about that great thing that that idea that Sharon raised there, that great idea about not believing what they tell you. I mean, all of us have that experience of when we went to school being told about Captain Cook discovering Australia, about the explorers. So they're not invaders, they are explorers, of the gold rush and the merino sheep, and how Aboriginal people just seem to vanish. And we were all brought up with that. To what extent are you seeing any change in that narrative? How do you begin to unwind that? How do you begin, Irene, to have those conversations? And at what age do you begin that? How do you dismantle the knowledge and power and that white kids walk into that class with, even at the age of 5 or 6? How is that actually being implemented?
Well, I just to put it in a context, I see that whole phenomena and the idea and what Sharon responds to as the notion and the advice from elders, don't believe a thing they tell you, is a way of protecting, of protecting the child from the avalanche that comes when we confront an education system which I would argue, and many others have, is in itself, culminates in itself as a form of epistemocyte. That is, that our own worldview, our own way of knowing has calculatedly been dismantled by the colonial system. And I think that this is intentional. It's all interrelated with the concept of genocide. And I don't throw the word around lightly, because we're talking about we're talking about big sorry business for this entire continent that we've experienced for more than 200 years, and globally for more than 500 years. This intentional systematic way of legitimising, in a colonial context, the theft of Aboriginal lands. And what goes with that is a process of constantly unpacking. And what gets unpacked is the notion, is the idea, are the worldviews, the Aboriginal worldviews. And as I've referred to, it's a form of epistemocide, and it is intentional, because we, as you were both noting, Stan, the idea of what happens when we go home to country, and that feeling, and that feeling of going home to country is not only just the relationship and the connection, but also it raises for us as First Nations our obligations to care for country. And so in the colonial context, we don't see a mirror for that, because the colonial context is about commodifying all of these relationships, of turning them into economic commodities, whereas our connections are different. They're intergenerational, they're spiritual, they're a relationship that we don't just hold in awe, but that we have an obligation. And I think for small people going to school and coming from Aboriginal families where they're they have that learning where they're lucky enough and their families are functioning to be able to pass on that generational knowledge of who we are as Aboriginal peoples, starts to become dismantled when they enter into the education system. So in terms of dealing with it, I mean, Sharon's thrown out one strategy. I don't believe a thing they say. I think that we need to equip our children to be able to have the language to talk back. For them to be able to, and also to create a society where they're secure and safe. I mean, we have our 5-year-old going to school and talking back to the myth, the Captain Cook myth, the Captain Cook lie. And we talk about our experiences of perhaps only being the one child in the playground. It's a huge challenge that our children, a huge obligation that our little people have to carry to be, and do they need to carry this? I think they do, because as Sharon had indicated earlier, if they don't, it creates a fracture within our own being. You know, we have to navigate a two-world space, but in a way where we're not fractured and where as you know, that young boy said, I just simply want to be an Aboriginal. So how do our kids be an Aboriginal person when they're entering this place, this education system that needs to stop unpacking Aboriginality?
Cheryl, it's really interesting, just listening to what Irene there said about Epistemocyte, and this idea that for us, we have to entertain the notion that we don't exist. We have to entertain the notion that when we interact with that other world, that skepticism, that hostility to our existence forces us to explain our existence in a way that people who are white people, to use that general phrase, white people for whom the world was created in their image, so they see, don't have to entertain that fundamental existential question. And just on the question of Epistemocyte, I'm just wondering whether there is an alternative here. I was, by happenstance, really fortunate to have avoided that because I barely went to school. For the first 13 years of my life, Mum and Dad were playing hopscotch with the welfare authorities. They were moving around constantly, right? And Dad was getting work wherever he could because he did not want the government in our lives. And it meant that I had a very sporadic education. I changed school 15, 16 times before I was out of school. And I barely went to school in any meaningful way till I was 13 or 14 because it was constantly interrupted with movement out of necessity, out of poverty, out of survival. But I learned something else. I learned a different way of being. I sat with my grandfather and my mother and my father, and they told me stories, and I lived in my mind. I developed an oral storytelling framework. I developed a different way of being able to imbibe knowledge and store knowledge and to be able to retrieve knowledge. So when I ultimately got into significant school and then out of school into university and into my career, that learning system, that epistemology actually benefited me. So I'm wondering, is there a case for actually saying that school is not a good place for us to be, and that there are alternatives either in the home, in the community, wherever that may be, that sit outside of that traditional framework of going to school, sitting in a classroom, getting a report every year, being graded, being moved up, being moved down, being judged, having to deal with the Epistemocyte that Irene spoke about. Are there other ways?
I totally support what you're saying, Stan, and similar to my experience too. Like, we moved around, I can't remember how many schools we went to growing up for that same reason, you know, because of the constant fear of welfare knocking at the door. And my grandmother was a single mother for many years, and she raised her children on her own and, you know, eventually moved to the city. But she had welfare sitting right next to her every day. And so there's always been this, you know, this instilled insight to us as peoples. And when I think about the legacy of, making sure that the house is clean, and, we were always pulled up early on a Saturday and Sunday morning, like we never had a rest as children, because these were what I call the inherited, aspects of my mother, from her mother, to ensure that everything was spick span and everything was all right, like everything had to have its place, because that's how they were conditioned growing up, in that context. But getting back to what Irene was saying, we still, terra nullius is a big lie. Everyone knows that it is. And yet we still legally have to prove our continuous connection with country, despite all the white man's laws that have impacted on our connection to our country and to our customs and to our practices. And we have to use their legal system to prove our continued connection with country. I just think, that just blows my mind to think about how every aspect of our life we have to utilise a white man's legal system to justify or try and justify our existence. And yet the benchmark is continually moved, because, if you look at native title as an example, and when we run, through Eddie Marbo's hard fight, and we actually got native title recognised, and then we see the government, they go and legislate changes, and then they go extinguish, country that we could have been claiming under native title. Like, it's that constant oppressive context about us having, every time we get close, the benchmark gets moved again, and then we all have to start all over again through a white man's legal system to build our case, to try and again prove our existence and our identity. It just frustrates me, no matter what, that we're still doing that today. And in the context of legal education, educational systems, we have some Aboriginal schools around Australia that are proving really good value for our children. They are speaking language, they are learning in an Aboriginal cultural context, we're involving elders in the school context, where storytelling is a very important part. The learning styles reflect our identity, it makes you proud, like it's all those sorts of things that we talked about that we get from our elders in our Aboriginal school context. And I feel that that's where we should be heading more and more, is, constructing the school environment not on the colonial education system. We need to learn, some of the context so we can actually get employment and things like that. I don't have any issues with that, because that's the reality of the world that we're living in. But embracing our inherent right, and for our future generations to be proud and strong in identity, and as Irene had already said, embedding pride and responsibility in our younger generations to carry our rights forward into the future and identity into the future, I think is really imperative, because the system itself now is already breaking that down that I see. And even in tertiary education, I know that there are a lot of our mob who have gone to get their tertiary qualifications, and they want to embed their identity and cultural practice with what they've learnt, say, for instance, as in a social worker context. And yet there's all these differentiating tools that they're taught, which is about distancing and not having connection, where our mob, we are a connected people. We want to be connected to fellows that work with us and provide services to us, because that's just our way. All those are sort of like opposite learnings that they're taught through a tertiary system. And then when they go and work in an entity, and a government entity, to try and make change happen, then they're pulled to account and they're challenged, because they're bringing their cultural identity to the role, but then they're told to get back in your little box, become part of the bureaucracy. You're not here to rock the boat for, your cause. You're here to do a job. So it's that constant struggle. And I've worked in the public sector system, and I see many of our mob even still today struggling with that. So we try and get our change agents in there, but you get pushed back into a box.
Sharon, it's a beautiful metaphor there that Cheryl's using, the box. And one of the things that we have to do, and I'm not totally conversant with what happens where you are, but one of the things we have to do constantly is we are bureaucratised. We have the government in our lives constantly, and we are asked to tick a box that says, are you Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, which is someone else's concept, someone else's language, someone else's idea that erases the multiplicity of identities and nations that we actually belong to. I don't ticket anymore. I write next to it my nation, and I'll make them work it out. But the ontological whiteness that Cheryl is talking about there, Sharon, this all-encompassing worldview, this way of being that we have to navigate, begins here, of course, with the concept of terra nullius and our legal invisibility, which then allows Europe to write itself on our landscape, to put fences across the land, to cut down trees, to blow up, hills and blow up our artifacts and take away children, that idea of an all-consuming whiteness. I'm just wondering how that contrasts with where you are and the level of self-determination, autonomy and sovereignty that exists around treaty that may empower you in ways that we are not, because we don't have that political legal recognition. We don't have those treaties.
Well, our people made treaty with the British Crown in 1876, and the treaty, we have lands that are our lands, or what we call Skungana, our sovereign lands, where we have our own governmental structures, and work on our languages, and we have limited contact with the outside world, so to speak. But then there's huge, I don't know if you're familiar with Turtle Island, but the northern part of Turtle Island, excluding what's happening south of us, but huge portions of Turtle Island, the majority of the people in that territory are our people, Anishinaabe, Nayoak, and Dene people, Inuk people, and so we're on the land a lot. And this recent pandemic thing that sort of forced everybody supposedly inside it, which we did, it was took to the land and took the children out on the land. And I remember getting a call from one of the leaders and said, sorry to say this, or maybe it's a good thing to say, this pandemic has been the best thing for us, because we had to take our children out on the land, and they had to learn how to live on the land. And that was the best thing, because we were able to get them away from that school system. And so they used it as a positive. And I think what we have to do as Indigenous peoples is that we have to come to the realization that the other world is not going to help us. So we have to stop looking at them for help, and we have to look at ourselves. And the other thing we have to know is that we were never going to have a lot of money. So that's, we'll just put that out there. And so we have to try to do things that are within our ability and create the maximum effect for what we're trying to do. So I have been working with young, mothers, or even before they have children, the ceremonies that they have to do before they even get pregnant, and then all the ceremonies that happen after the child comes from. And then, so by the time the child is 7 years old, they have gone through all of the major ceremonies of who they are as Navajo people, so that by the time if they go into a school system, they already have a fairly good idea of who they are, because they've gone through the ceremonies, and they have a name. Like, as soon as a child is born, we give them not a Munia or a non-Indian name, but we give them a spiritual name, even before they have the other name, so that this connects them directly to who they are. And this is a way to reimagine how our nations will look into the future, because we are not building just for this time frame. We are building for the next 7 generations. So 7 generations before me, there was the old people, the Kiteo, were talking about what are we going to do for the 7th generation, and I am the 7th generation. So now what am I doing for the next 7th generation, for the ones that are not even here? That's how, we are raised to think like that. And so we have the responsibility to start putting in place all those tools that we had 7 generations ago, and we need to put them there. So in 7 generations, that all of those tools will be back in place, and so that the future can continue. Because we know that the creation cannot exist without our help. If we don't help the creation will do away with us. And that, and we cannot give up that responsibility. Irene talked about that responsibility, and we have to really take that on seriously. And this time right now that we're in with this pandemic really forces us to look at what does the creation have for us, because they have lost their ability to use money against us, because they don't. What can they do with their money now? They can't do anything. It doesn't give them anything. But what do we have in relation to the creation? I was down in the river valley on the weekend looking at the berries and seeing when the berries are going to be ready, because I'm going to pick berries and I'm going to dry them so that I can have them in the wintertime. This is what and I'm taking young people in the valley with me, and I'm showing them those things, because this is what the creation has brought for us, and this is what we can use. So we need to think a new way of seeing the world. And it's the old way of seeing the world. It's our old people seeing these things, and we need to go back to that. So I say it's like the footprints of our ancestors are already on the land. We just got to find where the steps are, and we have to follow those steps. So this is, how I see us moving forward, and making sure that not to spend too much time thinking about what the colonizers are doing, because they're going to continue to try to destroy us. That we know that. So we shouldn't spend too much time thinking about them. What we have to do is think about, what are we doing for the future generations? What are we leaving them when we leave here? Because they're waiting for us to put something in place for them. And all these children that we have responsibilities for, because all of these children are our responsibility. And that's the one thing about this work that we do at the United Nations is to bring that forward. It's not just for us that we do this work; it's for them, so that they can see in the future that we were thinking about them, that we didn't forget about them, and that we left something for them. So whatever that is, that's what we need to do, and so that's how I see this school system that they created. It doesn't even work for their own people, if you look at it seriously. So why should we take it on and try to make it work for our people? It's to me, it's not logical. So we need to reimagine how that works and what works for our people, and go from there. And knowing that we're never going to have enough money, so we can't get caught up in that. Like, if we had the money, we could do this. That's not a reality. So yeah. I think we have to move away from those kind of thinking, and try to find a way forward in another way.
Yeah, I read it never cost me.
That's decolonization.
Yeah.
That is self-determination. It's making decisions about your future and then actually doing it.
Yeah, it's actually doing, isn't it? It never cost me a cent to sit with my grandfather and listen to him.
Exactly.
Irene, I'm really interested in this idea of coronavirus and how it's changing everything. It's clearly accelerating enormous change within the globe on a geopolitical level. It's also revealed the folly of so much of our privileging of economy over society. We've already hit the limits of neoliberalism in the 2007-2008 global recession, depression, financial crisis. It's been a constant churn of crisis over the last couple of decades. I'm just wondering how you see that playing out in Australia, Irene, given that we are still the poorest and most vulnerable, and those most at risk of this illness, if God forbid it ever took hold and tore through our communities. But we've also seen the incredible strength and resilience of our communities in the way that we've come together to be able to resist this and to be able to deal with this and keep it out of communities. And maybe there are indeed lessons in getting kids out of school, taking them back home, teaching them in a different way. How do you see coronavirus, Irene, and this, more broadly, this political moment as being a reset globally around so many issues, but also potentially another form of being able to decolonise and look at ways of preserving who we are as everybody grapples with their own vulnerability?
Well, I think exactly it does provide that opportunity. It provides a space for us to breathe in and think about how we're located as First Nations peoples in this pandemic that they call a pandemic.
And keeping in mind, sorry, Irene, that this is not the first to hit Australia, because our people were wiped out by introduced diseases. So we've already bear the scars in our DNA from pandemic.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point, because what impressed me greatly was how quick Aboriginal peoples across this continent that we now call Australia were to act and to protect community. We've done very well, where communities have been very affirmative and positive about closing down their boundaries and ensuring that people from outside didn't come in and spread the virus. So that was one thing that impressed me greatly, but it gave us an opportunity to think about, I think, the points, just to reiterate that the solutions are going to come from us. We already have them. It's not going to come from the money that governments and bureaucracies and corporations throw at our communities. We already have it, as, for example, as we all know, in the language. The language is coming back, and sure, the resources are good to support that, but we already have the connections, as Dennis Walker said, of bloodlines back to country, all of those tracks. So the track is already set in terms of who we are and our genealogies and our connections back to country. And just to take up that point, I think the work to be done is to get ourselves on track, but also to provide that vision for the young people who are. It's our responsibility to have that vision and to provide the roadmap to where that track is, in terms of, particularly for the kids who are saying, I just want to be an Aboriginal person. We have a responsibility and an obligation to, for not only to ourselves, but to provide that roadmap and a way of reimagining the future. And it's not reimagining, it's actually not a great deal of work. It's just keeping the cycle going that's been ongoing forever, for when we refer back to that terrible, the destruction recently that Rio Tinto in blowing up a very important special place to the people, custodians of that place. Our knowledges are ancient, and we have to take care of this country. We have to take care of ourselves, and we have to, in my view, ensure that the track is always clear and can be visualised and seen by the young people. And they're the conversations that I'm having with some of the young people about where to turn, where to look, how to do, how to go. And so we all have an obligation to keep that track clear so they can see and can reimagine the future, but also not just, and I do agree with this is the ongoing cycle about Aboriginal being. And whether we talk about it in cycles of 7 generations or as a notion of it has always been, always was, always will be, is a catchphrase that we've taken up in this country to really identify what we're talking about when we're talking about relationships. It's from the past into the present and into the future. It's a continuing cycle, and it's a cycle, and so it's different from a Western understanding or a way of being where they're progressing always to some point. Whereas it's a concept that is not ours. So I'm committed to concepts that are cyclical and ongoing, and there's no work we need to do on this. It's already here with us. It's to find the space and clear the track so we can always remember what it is and how we've always been, and to be able to have the space to simply be an Aboriginal person in our own knowledge ways.
Cheryl, just a couple of things. I'm really interested in how you navigate that, how you bridge those worlds and those ways of being, where you find that nourishment from, where you find the support and the strength from. And, you know, I know myself, there are times when I just have to retreat because I just have to. It becomes suffocating, and I get strength and I come back out and I engage again, and I'm always, you know, rubbing up against ways of being Wiradjuri, Gummalroy, Garrwa, ways of being that in a world where you are often meeting that scepticism or hostility, or a world that tries to frame that as if there is only one way of being Aboriginal, and it can be whatever we bring to it. So I want to know how you navigate that. And then also, as a follow-up to that, how important in giving us an architecture to protect the things that we need to protect, to give us a base from which to engage with the world and be who we are, how important are things like treaty, recognition, are those things mutually exclusive, constitutional recognition, sovereign treaty? How do we provide a political architecture? So first, just a bit of a personal reflection. And then more broadly, in a legal and political framework, how do we create that architecture to achieve what we want to achieve?
Well, Stan, you know, I also at times have to retreat. So I can definitely identify with that, because, I mean, sometimes you just get to a time where you just need to get back home on country, to be, you know, what I call rejuvenate, just to be, just to sit, you know, just to talk, you know, just to be. And that is really important. And, you know, and I've got great parents and elder support over the years. And one of the things that keeps me going is I grew up in an era, and, you know, Irene was there in that era as well, you know, where we had a lot of strong political leaders throughout our communities who had achieved a great deal of advancement for our rights and causes. You know, like we had Aboriginal housing, we had the Aboriginal legal services, we had our Aboriginal health services. Like, I was grown in an era where I really feel quite blessed, to be honest, where I had the strength and the learnings and supports of all those elders, and I always take that forward with me. And it's something that gives me strength every time, and it reminds me every time as to why it's important that I continue to do what I do. And I look at that as a legacy, and I look at that as a responsibility. And the other thing that I think that's really important in this conversation is that one thing that I realise from our leaders and our elders is that we've always had power. And no matter what, no matter the oppression, no matter the colonisation, no matter what, we stand strong and we keep moving forward. And I think that, to me, is something that is, I don't know, I come from a whole family of fellas who've, you know, and elders before me who have been strong in creating change, you know, for our people. So I look at it as a legacy and a responsibility, and I pass it on to my children. They have that legacy and responsibility. Because you know what? All of us have that responsibility, and all of us have a power, and have the power, and, you know, very much, you know, to what Bear was saying, is that we can do this, and we don't need the tools, and we don't need the architecture of colonisation to help us to do that, because it's never going to happen. We're going to always continually challenge and ask and have our voices heard. And, you know, when we get to the legal context and the political context, well, I personally don't feel that that's going to change anytime soon. You know, we already have, you know, our people in power who continually hold people like Captain Cook with a big, you know, badge of honour, and ignore the trauma and atrocities he's caused our people in this country. And that denial continually embeds racists and racism against our peoples, and again brings back that tidal wave of us having to justify why we're challenging a colonial, you know, heroism context, when in actual fact all it does is actually cause us pain and trauma. Going forward politically, I mean, you know, there's two ways that I think that they can happen. I mean, the Uluru Statement of the Heart to me is something that I'm very passionate about. And for us to be able to have our recognition as First Nations peoples in this country, whether it's by treaties or however it is, we need to move and evolve in Australia to that point of time. And lots of our mob have differing views, and this is the other thing.
That's good too. That's good.
I think it's great. I think it's great because, you know, everyone, you know, and some fellas want to see themselves as independent nations. And, you know, this is a really good time, I think, where lots of conversations are finally being had. And I think that's what recognition has opened up. It's actually made fellas really think, wow, what does that actually mean for me? What does it mean for our people? And there are already some successes, you know, around Australia, where mob was standing strong in their own identity and sovereignty, and being really clear that no matter what, the government does not impact on me. But I think we don't realise the power that we have still as peoples, and I think that anything that the Black Lives Matter campaign that has, you know, of late brought forward is about people getting back and calling for our rights and making people, you know, making government accountable. I think that's been really refreshing for me personally, because I see that our people are realising that there is power, and people power is really important. And once we get that strength back, and that's the thing that I'm seeing, there's a growing movement of people saying, no, this is not good enough. But I still don't feel that a lot of our mob realise that we do have the power.
Yeah.
And that's what I think the legacy that I've learned from elders before me is that they've always taught us that we've always had the power.
Yeah, no, I love that. We've got maybe 10, 12 minutes left. I just want to try to focus our attention now in this time that's left in what is an existential crisis for our kids, and that is kids being taken away still from our families and locked up in appalling numbers. There are parts of Australia where almost 100% of people in juvenile detention are Aboriginal kids. And Old Woman Bear, I wanted to go to you on this and just get your reflections on what may be being done in Turtle Island in Canada about this. One of the things that we confront as First Nations people, and my father had to teach me these lessons, and I've had to teach my boys these lessons, and sadly they've had to use these lessons, is how to navigate the legal system, is how to deal with police, to prepare your children for the day when they will be confronted and harassed and potentially abused by police. And, my kids, by any measure, if you're using a socioeconomic measurement to the eyes of white Australia, would appear to be privileged kids. They've lived in other parts of the world. They've had a good education. They have, solidly socioeconomically middle-class lives. And yet, when they're out, and they're with their cousins and they're with their friends, they have been abused. They have had people, the police yell abuse at them. They have had their bags taken off them and tipped up and left all over the ground, and they've had to negotiate this, and I've had to prepare them to have the language and the knowledge of rights to be able to deal with those situations in a way that ensures their safety and does not allow for an escalation that could put them in danger. And they've had to use those lessons. And I'm just wondering where you are, what the initiatives are in terms of dealing with that threat, the reality of having someone take your life or your liberty, and the greater likelihood of that being either, a First Nations person, a Black person, or whatever that may be. What are the lessons we can draw from your experience?
Well, the northern part of Turtle Island, otherwise known as Canada, I think they're over the last 20 to 30 years, they've had somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or 22 different inquiries into police actions against Indigenous peoples. And the most recent was a year ago. A report came on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And that was, called for a huge amount of, supposed to be, changes to the system, because, disproportionately Indigenous women and girls and men are murdered and disappear in this country. They were supposed to make changes to do something about that, and the year has gone, and of course nothing has come about, because they have all these reports and they put them on the shelf, and nobody ever sees the next thing to it. And women and girls and Indigenous men are still being murdered, some by the police, some by unknown people. I used to always say I was fortunate, my family was fortunate, that we didn't have the issue of a murder or missing woman, girl, or man in my family until last December, when my cousin was found murdered by persons unknown. She was in her early 50s, a psychologist, professionally trained, but an Indian woman, and they found her on the side of the road in the wintertime. So and they still don't know who did that, but there's the amount that you're talking about people incarcerated. There is in next province over from where I am, Saskatchewan, there is a jail there, juvenile detention center, 100% First Nations people, young people, 100%. There's 7 of those kind of institutions in that province, and mostly incarcerated. And our people make up, quote unquote, less than 7% of the population, but are the majority of the people in these institutions. So we are a huge economic force for all of the security guards, the cooks, the people that supply those centers. So it's a source of income for the non-Indigenous world, and it gives a disproportionate view that we are more criminally minded than the rest of the society, and therefore when people stand up about land rights or saying that things shouldn't happen, they are very quick to move to criminalize us. Just recently in Alberta, which is the province where I'm in right now, they passed legislation that people are not allowed to hold up railways or any kind of transportation routes, and you could be fined up to $25,000 a day, and you could get jail time. So, and this is targeting our people, because there was, standoffs in relation to infrastructure shutdowns of railways and roads. So, the colonizers are very quick to move to try to protect themselves, and they target us, our people, disproportionately, which is why we do a lot of work at the United Nations to bring the attention of the world to what Canada is doing, because Canada tries to give the impression that they're, a very first world country and they're great people. And even Bono from the band said that they need more Canadas, and I said, oh my God, the world does not need any more Canadas. But thank goodness Canada didn't get elected to the Security Council. So I think we need to constantly tell the world that we're still here, that the world has to know that we're still here, because one of the great it's 30 years now since Oka with the Mohawks. This year on July the 11th was 30 years, which was only on Saturday, that when the military was brought out against the Mohawks. And they just brought out the military against the people in British Columbia, the Gitxsan people. They brought out the paramilitaries against the Indian people. So this is a very militaristic country, and they try to pretend that they're not. But the targeted people are the Indigenous people, and they take our children at a disproportionate rate. Most of the children in care in this country are Indigenous children, most of them. And there's a great wealth generated for non-Indigenous peoples having Indigenous children in care. And to me, it's a revenue generating mechanism for the non-Indigenous world that they target our children and use our children for that. And our ability to get our children back is, very difficult once a child is brought into care because of the restrictions that they place on people. So it's a very racist country that says that, like, the racism that is directed at our people is that they say that the best interest of the child is to take the child away from the nation. That is not the best interest of the child. That is the best interest of the state. And the best interest of that child is to find a way for that child to stay within the nation. And that is the difficult part. And we have to, as Indigenous peoples, find a way to keep our collective rights to our children and not individualize them. Because the state is busy individualizing them by saying it's the best interest of the child to be raised away from the nation. And we as nations must stand up and say, no, the best interest of that child is to remain within the nation. And that is, to me, is a very important thing that permeates all our nations around the world, because, that Irene mentioned earlier in the discussion, the Genocide Convention. And one of the elements that both Australia and Canada and other states have said, the Genocide Convention does not apply, but yet when you look at it, it says that if children have been targeted for special treatment designed to alienate them from their people, that's an act of genocide. And that's what people don't want to see. They don't want to see that, because then they're all culpable. Because every one of the people in these countries know that our children are being used by the colonizing state to destroy our nations. And so they're all culpable. And that's the one thing that we need to continue to talk about. They are collectively responsible for what is going on, and they have to be held accountable. And that's what they don't want to talk about. So they try to put it off onto us and say, well, you are at fault. You didn't do this, you didn't do that. When it's them that are really at fault. And so I think that's, we have to turn the conversation around in a major way. Sorry.
Irene, just to that's lovely. Irene, just a final thought from you to wrap up here, and that is, to come back to the film, In My Blood It Runs, and Dujuan, and he makes the point in there about people being taken away to juvenile detention, and this lovely word that he uses, crueling kids, that you are being subjected to cruelty. Interesting as well that Alderman there makes the reference to the militarisation of the state. We saw the army rolling down the streets of Indigenous communities with the Northern Territory intervention, at imposing curfew and lockdown on communities well before coronavirus lockdown. We also saw in the film the use of counter-terrorism squads on the streets of Alice Springs because Aboriginal children were playing outside late into the night and were deemed to be a threat. So the militarisation is very present in people's lives in the long arm of the state. So I just wanted to get a final thought from you, given that the horrific numbers of kids that are locked up or kids that are being taken out of care. What do we do? What can we do now to make an immediate difference to this?
Well, look, we can use the civil laws of the state to have an immediate impact, and one simply, which is being lobbied for across the nation, is to raise the age of criminal responsibility in response to what can we do immediately. And there are many things that we can do immediately. But the problem that we have, and I just want to go back to the point that Sharon raised, is that we're on this treadmill of forever, treading water in this same space of waiting for the state to enact the laws and use the powers that they have. We confronted this right back even with my peoples when we were invaded and all of our lands were stolen and many of our ancestors were murdered, was we were deemed British subjects. Not that we agreed that we were British subjects, but now we're deemed Australian citizens. Not that we agreed that we're Australian citizens by any, it's been an act of a unilateral act of the state. The point I'm making is that the state has the power to make everyone's life better. The question is, why do we return decade after decade after decade and ask the same question? For example, deaths in custody is worsening. Child removal is worsening. And my response to that is because the state has power, an unchecked power to continue to use that power and direct that power towards the retaining that colonial position of Aboriginal peoples. And I would argue it's a position that began at the time of Cook's entry into this country. So until we understand that Aboriginal peoples are different, that our rights are collective, it's not a human rights individualised response that we're calling for, but we need to look at what the Genocide Convention says and see and ask the question, when will Australia be called to give account to the acts of genocide that have been committed and continue to be committed today? So so we can have the Uluru Statement and we can have any number of declarations or organisations or bureaucracies or treaties, etc. But until we have a real ability to equalise that power imbalance where the state is called to give account in an international forum and be able to correct those injustices, we're going to be back here in the next decade having the same conversation about why Project ABC failed. Because we're dealing with an unchecked power of the state to admit that it's a colonial entity and to commit to a process of decolonisation.
And I think we're at a real hinge point of history too, where they're hitting the limits of political liberalism and the idea of endless progress and endless economic growth, and there is a blowback happening in many different ways, from political authoritarianism, the rise of China, Black Lives Matter, various tensions that are emerging that are reshaping geopolitics, and we're uncertain about exactly how that's going to end up. And you're right. Anything that is negotiated within a framework that is fundamentally premised on the extinction of people and the eradication of rights is difficult to begin with until you've actually fundamentally looked at dismantling part of that system. It's been really, I could talk to all of you all day. It's been fantastic, and we've been able to discuss children, which is fundamentally what we are discussing here, but education, how we improve those educational outcomes, the oppressive cultural assumptions that trap so many of our children, incarceration, political framework, culture, reviving culture, language, and the strength of who we are, and taking away that wonderful phrase from Old Woman Bear, from her elders, don't believe what they tell you. It's a wonderful way to finish, and I think a wonderful line to finish on. Old Woman Bear, Sharon, thank you so much. Cheryl, always good to see you. And Irene, I'm always grateful when I'm smarter by the company that I keep, and that's what it was like today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.